afternoon and welcome to CJLO 1690 AM. My name is Michael Brody and I'm joined by Shane Simmons. How are you today, Shane?
Well, I'm feeling a little bit murderous.
Well,
tying into this week's episode.
Sure. Let's jump right into the theme. So earlier this week, on Wednesday evening, I saw an avant-premiere for the new blockbuster Rian Johnson film entitled Knives Out.
And I didn't go because it was a new blockbuster Rian Johnson film.
And also because you're afraid to leave your home.
No, mostly because he's dead to me.
For fear of being murdered in a drawing room.
At least I can look forward to that half-hour-long summation explaining how it was done in what room by Colonel Mustard with the crowbar.
And you said you didn't see it.
Yeah. What, did I just guess the ending?
You know you did. So, I have seen Knives Out about 10 days off from the actual release date. And it is not a bad movie. It's okay. I have many problems with it, as I do with many mainstream movies, but that's neither here nor there. This is not a spoiler episode for Knives Out. What this is you and I discussing, depending on how much time we have, up to 35 better murder mystery whodunnits.
I'm sure we'll get to every single one.
Well, at the end, if we don't make it, I can just quickly list them off, and those attentive listeners can jot down as many as they feel they trust us to have mentioned.
Well, we're compelled to talk about this because the whodunit genre is kind of dead these days. So that's why Knives Out is a bit of an anomaly. Kind of worth checking out. I do actually want to see it at some point. Simply because whodunits, even though they used to be incredibly common, have become a bit of a rarity.
Absolutely.
If you look up whodunit films now, you'll get a long list of many films that are not whodunits. Mm-hmm. Simply because, it's slightly mysterious who might have done this particular crime. But the whodunit, for me, is a genre that has a very specific structure to it. And the classics really all happened in the 1930s and 40s. Basically with the advent of the talkies, where we could now have people discussing the crime and bringing all the suspects in for the great denouement where the detective lets everyone know his findings. And there were entire series based around its structure. My favorite, of course, being the Thin Man movies. But there were many others, multiple Charlie Chan, Mr. Moto. Sherlock Holmes, not so much, because Sherlock Holmes never quite loaned itself to that structure. Sherlock Holmes was always more about how done it or what's going on, as opposed to, I think the only Sherlock Holmes story that really falls into the whodunit genre would be The Hound of the Baskervilles, and even that is more of what's really going on here and how was it accomplished.
Yeah, The Hound of the Baskervilles, you're a Sherlock Holmes aficionado. I am not, but my understanding is Hound of the Baskervilles, by and large, and it is my personal experience, is considered the most reviled of all the books and or stories. Well, there's only one book. So.
Well, that's incorrect. I don't know where you came up with that impression.
I thought it was awful compared to many of the short stories.
Certainly
It's out of character for the way the others are written.
It is out of character, like I said, because it's the closest when it comes to a whodunit. There are many better short stories in the Sherlock Holmes canon.
It's also the longest.
Well, there are 60 stories total, 4 of which are novels, and only a couple of the novels are quite good. Mm-hmm. The Sign of Four is also quite good, but again, it's more of a how was this accomplished rather than here's a list of suspects, which one did it.
Sure. I do remember that even on the Sherlock television show, the recent BBC reimagining of the Sherlock Holmes, of all of the things they have either originated or adapted, the Hound of the Baskervilles episode is by far the worst one.
Well, it was also the loosest of any adaptation they did on that show, because they're pretty loose. They really went far. Well, yeah, but they're still...
The Irene Adler episode springs to mind as a ridiculously
loose yet, but still grounded in the original material, whereas the Hound one goes very far astray.
I mean, that sequence in the book in which we see Irene Adler decapitated through one of her many adventures, oh wait, that's a complete fabrication.
I didn't say it wasn't elaborated upon.
Getting back to our topic, I will remind the listener, only because I know I didn't say it up top, you're listening to our show, which is called Cinema Smackdown. So I said today we're going to talk about up to 35 better whodunnits than Knives Out, just because if you're off to see Knives Out and you haven't seen these, maybe watch these instead. Stay home. Don't give Ryan Johnson any more money.
Well, certainly it would help to have a background in what this genre is all about before you see the shameless modernization, postmodern knockoff.
Well, I have a structure to my recommendations today. I have 7 movies which I consider to be fantastic, classic examples of the genre. I've tried to stay away from the obvious movies. I am not going to, beyond mentioning it right now, talk about The Usual Suspects, because you've heard of it, you already know how it ends. It's not a movie we need to get into, but I'm going to bring up a few that are a little less well-known. So I have 7 straight-up recommendations. Then I have 11 what I would call offbeat whodunnits, movies in which you might say to yourself, wait, that's a whodunit? Well, yeah, it is, as long as you understand the structure. And some of those don't even have deaths in them, but they're still whodunit films that play upon figuring out a piece of information in a certain way. I'll get to that
and
later.
At some point during the show, I will feed you some arsenic in laced tea, a la Miss Marple type of mystery. And as you succumb to that, I will take over by talking about Agatha Christie ad nauseum.
Perfect. So as I said, I'll have some straight-up recommendations, some offbeats, and then I just have things I call interesting additions to the genre, which are just more movies that do fit it, but are less notable than the first few I want to talk about. So let's jump in with the straight-up recommendations. Many of these are movies you and I have talked about before for different reasons that I consider to be the height of the genre on my end. And when I say the height of any genre, I usually mean something super weird no one's ever heard of. I will start off by saying a movie that I went doing some research. This movie was on 0 lists, which freaked me out because I consider it to be the finest whodunit I've ever seen because it really plays on your expectations. It is a movie directed by Kenneth Branagh called Dead Again. On no whodunit lists. On the internet, at any rate. Nowhere that I saw.
Well, people get sidetracked by the reincarnation aspect of that film. So
it's a very legitimate movie about a murder mystery and how it affected the future lives of 2 people who are reincarnated from a murdered couple. They reunite 50 years later, I want to say, something along those lines, doomed to repeat the process that split them up in the first place. The murder and subsequent execution of one of the partners for that murder that they claimed they were innocent of. And so you watch Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson fall in love in this movie. And I believe you do, actually. It is one of those films where you really see a couple connect and have chemistry on screen. Because in real life, they were figuring their thing out together.
Right, also during Henry V.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
you can see that relationship. It's like, oh, what a cute couple. I hope they never... Oh, they got divorced.
Well, it turns out they were dating the same other woman, apparently. So that may have had
that'll
something
do it.
to do with it. But I absolutely love the movie Dead Again. It's written by Scott Frank. It's his first film. Scott Frank went on to do some really interesting work over the years, including a 7-episode Netflix Western show last year, the title of which is completely escaping me, but it's excellent. It is one of those things, you can look up Scott Frank on Netflix and you'll find it immediately, but it's one of those things where it's a 7 or 10 hour movie, and it really, really is a beautiful addition to the Western genre. But we're not here to talk about Westerns, we're here to talk about murder mysteries and whodunits. Dead Again is, for me, one of the most satisfying of all of these movies, so that's why I bring it up first and foremost. I will now jump to another movie that I don't think is as much of a crowd pleaser, but it's my favorite of the genre, no matter what, forever, and that movie is Rennie Harlin's Mindhunters, which is only... It takes a chunk to realize you are watching a whodunit, because it is it's a movie about a group of profilers in training, FBI profilers, who profile serial killers, who are brought for their final exam to an island where they must solve a staged murder of a serial killer's work, only to learn, to their great horror, that they are being murdered one by one of their own. And I love the characters in this movie. I love the outrageous plotline. The deaths in this film are ridiculously over the top. It is an exploitation movie to the nth degree. Another thing I challenge the viewer to do when watching Mindhunters, watch the first 15 minutes and decide for yourself who the protagonist is. And then watch that person get brutally executed. And then you'll have to regroup and decide who the new protagonist is. And the movie goes on like that. It
certainly has shades of, mentioning Agatha Christie again, it has shades of, And Then There Were None, which is a similar premise of watching your entire cast get bumped off one by one. It's like, wait, who's the killer?
Yeah. It is an absolutely entertaining film from top to bottom, providing you like trash. Because it's a trashy, fun movie. It features Johnny Lee Miller, LL Cool J, Christian Slater, Val Kilmer in a hilarious mentor role. Like he's really in his own movie.
And if you want guidance in life, who better to go to than Val Kilmer?
And there's a whole cast of character actors. It's just, for me, a perfect piece of entertainment, including one of the most spectacular last acts of a film I've ever seen. It has an ending that's just complicated enough that I find it really pays off in repeat viewings. It is one of those movies that it's fun to watch. You get to the end and you go, wow, how did they get there? Rewatch it with a friend and watch their face change. Get to some of those moments. So that's Mindhunters. Let me see another one. Another one that I think is above reproach in terms of a whodunit is A Perfect Getaway, which we've mentioned a few times.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Over the years. The Tim Oliphant, Steve Zahn, Mila Jovovich, David Toohey extravaganza. We did a whole episode about David Toohey a year ago.
And A Perfect Getaway is one of his finest films.
Yeah.
So cleverly written that many people watch it and don't realize or misinterpret things as being plot holes, when in fact, no, watch it again. That scene was brilliantly written.
Yeah.
Because it means two different things on two different viewings.
And it is not a movie that is terribly hard to figure out, but...
Well, I mean, for a whodunit, the list of possible suspects is very small, and yet it still keeps you guessing.
Yeah, and it definitely has an explanation sequence that is super satisfying as far as I'm concerned. It worked for me on every level when I have heard people dismiss the movie once they hear the explanation.
As far as I'm concerned, it's almost Sixth Sense level of reinterpreting what you've just seen.
Yeah. It's a delightful film. So that's Perfect Getaway by David Toohey. It's a really interesting movie, especially given the performances are really something. Everyone in this movie, they're not necessarily actors I love, but I love them in this. If
you want to see Mila Jovovich be good at doing something other than killing zombies, this is the film for you.
This is definitely the film for you. I will very quickly give a shout out to one more film before we break, which is DOA. Now, you've got two DOAs to choose from. You've got the one from the 50s with Edmund O'Brien, and you've got the one from 1988 with Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. I far, far prefer the Shameless remake.
I would kind of go there myself. I've seen both, of course, but...
It has such an eloquent reason for being a whodunit. It takes the entire movie to find out what the motivation is, but when you get there, it's a fantastic payoff.
Well, the basic premise of it is unique in whodunits in that it is someone trying to solve their own murder because he's been poisoned with a slow-acting poison that gives him enough time to figure it out.
And there's no safety net coming. He's not going to magically recover from this. There's no. I got to find the antidote. He has been poisoned to death, but he has something like 24 hours.
Yeah, about 24 hours.
He will die. All right. Well, we'll be back in a moment with more whodunits that are better than Knives Out.
Is this a comic show?
No, it's an ad for a comic shop.
An ad for...
Played it once before. It would be interesting if there was an actual comic
show about comics, yeah. Well, let's dump this piece of crap and pitch that.
It's a much more limited topic.
It is.
For at least for us.
Mm-hmm.
And getting you to watch a movie is like pulling teeth. Getting you to read an entire graphic novel every week would be, or 8 of them, would be a little rough.
We can whine about all those wonderful adaptations.
They have a nice score in there. Oh, it's not score, it's somebody's song. Just electronic John Carpentry. And we're back on CGL at 1690 AM. You're listening to Cinema Smackdown, where this week we're running down movies that are whodunnits that are better than this coming week's release, Knives Out. Now, again,
I'm enjoying your choices so far, and I'm still over-anticipating what your next one might be.
Again,
because I know one that has to be on the list.
I don't mean to slag Knives Out. It will make a lot of people very happy. I just think that if you're going to go with a whodunit for your night's entertainment, you should see every one of these films first. My next choice, I'll leap to the one I'm pretty sure you think I'm going to say next, which is The Last of Sheila.
That's the one.
That's the one. It is the second to last of my straight-up recommendations. I just jumped to it because it is, in its own way, a weird and perfect film with the greatest, you will never in a million years see the events of this ending coming film of all time.
But it has a legendary ending. I showed this at movie night, and it is still referenced to this day, years and years later.
Yeah, it is. It is a spectacular what is going on ending that is incredibly rewarding.
Oh, yeah.
And bizarre. But it is an entirely strange movie. It's a whole film based around the idea that James Coburn plays a movie producer who loves games and therefore invites people to his mansion, his yacht, his different places over the years. In this case, it's a yacht named, is it Sheila?
Yeah, that's the one.
And he makes his friends and partners, actors, directors play these games whether they want to or not for his own amusement, and it all turns into a whodunit at a certain point. And the element of the whodunit comes in at an interesting point, and it completely changes what you've been watching up to that point, which is just, it's some cute little games I have to figure out before the characters do, which transforms into...
Yeah, it has one of those whodunit structures, which you don't see too often, but it does come up in some of the classics, where you hang out with characters long before the murder happens. Yeah. And you get to better appreciate, there's a lot of people who kind of want this person dead.
On the side note, the interesting thing about this film is it's written by Stephen Sondheim and Anthony Perkins.
Yes, that was
Psycho.
That's the big one for me. It's like, wow, not only is this a weird, you've never seen a murder mystery quite like this one, but it was written by two really famous guys who are not known as screenwriters.
Yeah, and they... the reasoning, apparently, is that in Hollywood they had legendary reputations for playing games like this. They would create their own drawing room mystery games for their friends, their celebrity friends, to play, so apparently that carried over.
It's kind of escape room type antics before escape rooms.
That's a good point. A lot of it is. A lot of very clever, figure out how something happened to get to the next puzzle piece ideas in there. But again, I can't underline this enough. This movie has such a spectacularly bizarre ending that it becomes almost the best example of the genre, despite being completely unique. So that's that.
Yeah,
movie.
It comes down to a couple of props, and we'll leave it at that. But but it's such
fine.
a wonderful. It's like, what is happening right now? Oh, that's wonderful.
So that is The Last of Sheila, directed by Herbert Ross. Starring, who would we say it stars? Other than Coburn, it's...
James Mason is in it.
Raquel Welch? No, it's not Raquel Welch. It's another actress of the time.
I don't have the cast. Yeah. Richard Benjamin.
Yeah, Richard Benjamin's great in it. He's he is
real.
I kind of don't like Richard Benjamin when he's just playing some nice guy, but he's interesting and devious in this, which is a lot of fun. I kind of like him better as a likable villain. He has something eerie about him in general, I find.
Mm-hmm.
So it works for me.
Yeah, well, likable villain, like in what's it, Love at First Bite.
I don't remember him in that.
He plays the Van Helsing type of character. Yeah.
I mean, as you say it, I'm remembering the last scene of the movie.
He's the guy who stands in opposition to the burgeoning romance between the leading lady and Dracula.
Yeah,
George Hamilton's Dracula.
I do recall that. Yeah, I saw that film when it was released. So, my final straight-up recommendation of a murder mystery, and this is a good segue into my offbeat whodunits. My final recommendation straight up, Young Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, yeah.
Which let's be clear, doesn't really present itself as a whodunit, but it does sort of come around to that kind of plot structure eventually.
Yeah, well, young Sherlock Holmes among Sherlock Holmes fans is kind of a sticking point because it is wildly off canon.
Yeah. The idea that these two characters, Watson and Holmes, met as essentially teenagers. I was going to say children, but
not quite teenagers.
Watson seems younger than Holmes in this.
Right. Well, technically he is actually in canon.
Oh,
but,
I didn't know that.
But they're not very far separated. Yeah, he's about 12-ish, I guess, and Sherlock Holmes comes across as like a 13, 14-year-old maybe.
No, I'd say Holmes is more like 17 in this. But okay.
Well, more like a 16, 17-year-old playing younger.
Yeah, or a 20-year-old playing younger. I don't know. I'd have to go back and check it, but my recollection is that he's a little bit older. I mean, it is about his grand romance, after all.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like it's a take on someone's general misunderstanding of what a Sherlock Holmes adventure is, but it's good in its own right.
Exactly.
As being this sort of misunderstanding, and one of the misunderstanding elements is like, well, Sherlock Holmes is a detective, so it's a whodunit, right?
And the entire movie really, really, really super benefits from, if you haven't seen Young Sherlock Holmes, if you do watch it in the near future, watch it to the end of the credits. It is one of those movies where pretty much the best moment in the film is afterwards.
Yeah, it has a post-credit sequence that is essential
nice
to your appreciation of the film.
Exactly. And
I remember seeing this in theater, and it ends with a carriage leaving the scene. And then over the whole end credits, there's a carriage, and it's going through snow, and it takes a while for you to realize, wait a minute, that's not the same carriage we saw at the end of the film.
Right.
This is a whole other carriage carrying a whole different character.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And enough said about that, because it is a very cute little film. It does fall well into the interesting period of Spielberg's Amblin production company actually making movies that have, how would I put it, kind of a bite or an attempt to do something different. This is in the same period as Poltergeist.
Right.
So they were making different kinds of films. And
it's willing to be a little more horrifying than your usual kid fare.
Yeah. It's quite a bit more horrifying.
Yeah, to the point where people jokingly refer to it as Sherlock Holmes and the Temple of Doom.
Yeah, and it falls fine into that category.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a safe children's movie. That's another thing about it. A lot of these movies are very, very safe. This one feels a little bit more dangerous and makes good on that promise in a few respects. All right, that's enough of our straight-up recommendations. I'm going to move to possibly my favorite thing to talk about here, which is offbeat whodunits, movies that you might not even consider as whodunits until I lay out why.
We'll all be the judge of that.
The number one I wanted to mention, because I was just looking through lists of films yesterday. This was on no one's list. It's only me. But it just popped into my head as, well, of course this is a whodunit. There is a movie from about 10 years ago, I think it's around 2008, starring Ryan Reynolds, called Definitely Maybe. The structure of Definitely Maybe is that Ryan Reynolds is a dad who has a 12-year-old daughter. And he and his daughter are spending the afternoon together. And at some point, his daughter asks him, "So, Dad, how did you and Mom meet?" And he says to her, "Well, it's kind of an interesting story." And he begins to tell her the tale of every woman he's ever dated. And it occurs to me about 15 minutes into
That sounds like
film,
a familiar TV show.
It hit me about 15 minutes into the show. They're not going to tell us who the mom is until the end. It is left to us to suss out which of these characters could be the mother. And the whole point here is we see him date people when he's quite young who he breaks up with or who break up with him, who reappear later on down his timeline and could still turn out to be the mother. So there's a lot of guesswork involved. And it's a very interesting film, but it absolutely follows the whodunit structure, including a reveal scene at the end, which all comes together.
Yeah, well, when we say whodunit, it doesn't necessarily mean who done the murder.
Exactly. So Definitely Maybe with Ryan Reynolds. Not only is it a fun addition to a whodunit genre, but it's also an excellent little movie, and it has a lot of Canadian content in that it is Reynolds, who is Canadian, and the director, whose name totally escapes me, is also a Canadian who has a pretty decent career in Hollywood, but keeps coming back here to do the occasional film and television show. and he's got a level of quality in his writing I'm quite fond of. So I give a big thumbs up to definitely maybe at least if you're gonna watch a romantic comedy movie, this one has more to it. It's got an underlying interesting premise. So that's my first offbeat whodunit. My second offbeat whodunit is a movie you may have more to say about. It's The Burbs.
Oh,
The Burbs is absolutely, at its core, a weird whodunit. Because the real question is there a dunnit? There is a missing family as far as certain people are concerned in the movie. That family vanished. And everyone's like, no, you idiot, they moved. There's no whodunit to be had here. But it's a tiny underlying plot thread in an otherwise weird comedy about the strange people who become your neighbors. And I'm quite fond of the film. I don't know. What's your take on The Burbs?
Well, The Burbs for me will always be remembered as a whodunit where I was nearly the one who done it. Because when I went to see this film, I was told in advance, it opens with a shot that I had long dreamed of, which is I believe it starts with the Universal logo, and then it zooms down to the earth all the way down to a single house.
Yep.
Which, in the 80s, was a special effects shot of some difficulty.
I mean, the only way you could do it back then was to launch a rocket into space with a camera, and then...
Specifically with Joe Dante tethered to it.
And a really big parachute.
So I was really eager to see that shot, and I got into an altercation with the ticket booth monkey, who
that's hilarious.
who took forever to understand what I was trying to say, that I would like to buy one ticket for The Burbs. And I came very, very close to walking in late for that shot. And I wanted to throttle him through his his little tiny plexiglass circle.
I want to know how many more of these movies involve you nearly murdering someone.
I think
our own Shane.
Well, considering it's pretty much a daily occurrence with me, it could be all of them.
The Burbs is a slightly off-putting comedy starring Tom Hanks. It was put out during the period of time in which Tom Hanks was no longer really famous or well-liked in Hollywood. People don't remember this. There's a window of time right before Big, when he fell massively out of favor and was starting to make movies that just didn't do well and that everyone was uncomfortable with. So in that period, he made The Burbs, he made Punchline, and he made Joe versus the Volcano. All of which fell
the phenomenal hit, Joe versus the Volcano, which we both love.
And no one
else
exists.
does.
or if they do, they don't.
Well, I've heard Tom Hanks himself go on talk shows and slag that film.
Or complain. I think
that's the only thing that has ever made me dislike Tom Hanks at all, was him speaking ill of Joe versus Volcano, which I'm sure is a blot on his career from his perspective. But it is probably my highest recommended Tom Hanks film in general.
Yeah, of course. It's a magical... How do I put it? It's a spiritual journey movie that won't insult you.
Yeah.
But it is farcical, which a lot of people... It's hard to get behind farce.
It also spoke to me on a personal level because the job he has at the opening of that film, that was a job I had, and those were my coworkers.
I think a lot of people can watch that sequence
and think the same thing,
this is a level of Dante's hell.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people beyond me can look at that and go, oh, I had that job, and I hated those people too.
Yeah, well, it's off topic of whodunits, but Joe versus the Volcano doesn't really... There's no movie that gets a higher recommendation for me. There's about 5. And of the people should really see these just in case it works for them movies, and that's one of them. My next offbeat whodunit, Happy Death Day.
Okay.
Which is a movie about a person who they themselves die over and over and over. And it doesn't strike you as a whodunit for quite a while, because it seems more circumstantial.
It's a time loop Groundhog Day slasher film.
Yeah, and it does eventually come around to... It does need to answer this question. Why is this happening? Is there an instigating factor? And I thought it was a pretty satisfying conclusion, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, it really is structured in a way that doesn't ask that question. So it takes you down many other paths, all of which have value. But when that one finally comes up, you realize, oh, I've been watching a whodunit all along.
Right.
So that's a very interesting one. we've mentioned that one once or twice on Time Loop episodes, which I did a whole show on a year and a half ago, where we talked about the endless number of Groundhog Day style movies that have come out, and it's kind of nuts now how that's a genre. But that's all I really have to say about Happy Death Day. My next slightly offbeat one for offbeat whodunit would be Backdraft.
Oh yes, okay.
Remember Backdraft?
Yeah.
That is a movie about a mystery arsonist.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Sure enough.
we're watching a series of investigations that are leading us closer and closer to it, while understanding the personal lives of the firemen involved and the investigators. Most people remember, if they've seen the movie, there's a real powerful performance from Donald Sutherland as well as Robert De Niro in one sequence, which is just a fun little mini movie in and of itself.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little. It's almost it has a certain Silence of the Lambs aspect to it, of an investigator visiting someone in prison who has specialized knowledge about something.
I'll remind our listeners that you're listening to CJLS 1690 AM. Our show is called Cinema Smackdown, and today Shane and I are talking about whodunits that are better than Knives Out, the Rian Johnson movie that's coming out on Friday. And I don't know if you disagree. Oh, you haven't seen Knives Out, I was going to say. I don't know if you disagree yet that some of these aren't as good, but I think every one of these films is significantly better than Knives Out.
Well, I will happily concede that point, just because anything Rian Johnson touches from here on out will forever be tainted for me.
Right.
Because whodunit? Well, we know whodunit when it comes to who murdered the Star Wars franchise.
I'm sorry, did Kathleen Kennedy direct Knives Out?
Well, she was an accomplice. She's the one who will go to prison, and Rian Johnson will, shake his fist at the detective and leap into the volcano or into the river, or suffer the untimely demise that so many of the perpetrators of the whodunits ultimately do.
My next choice for an offbeat whodunit is a movie I know you didn't enjoy, but I keep urging you to rewatch. It is a film called Detention, which came out about 6 years ago, and it takes about 8 genres of film and puts them in a blender. To some people's horror, I think you were one of them, but to other people like myself, I could recognize there was probably about 3 great movies worth of ideas crammed into this, which I kind of wish there was only 1.5 great movies worth of ideas, but I still really appreciate this film, Detention. I will say that the whodunit aspect of it is played out. They do take it from point A, B, all the way to the end, but it's not as important as the super weird journey of that movie, which is almost incomprehensible to... I don't mean that you can't understand the film, it's just really hard to sum up in a couple of words. But Detention is kind of a phenomenal movie that was probably made for no one. It's not an established audience that it was looking for.
If I gave it a second shot, I'm still quite sure I would enjoy it, but I will readily admit that my first and only viewing of the film was tainted by a very negative technical issue with the film. I saw it on a TV that had been enhanced to that one of those where they add the frame rates or something, and
digital smoothing.
There's some it's a setting that should just not exist on certain technology. It made the whole film
work apparently for football games.
Oh, I'm sure it's fine for football games, but for a feature film, it makes something shot on film or something meant to look like it was shot on film or digital. It looks like videotape.
Yeah.
And that really had a negative taste in my mouth for the entire film, in addition to the fact that I was not enjoying the content.
Well, Detention is... How do I put it? It is one of those movies that I can imagine that you get 40 minutes in and go, okay, it just changed genres again, I'm getting annoyed. I think it's one of those films that if you watch almost any 10-minute chunk, you'll be struck by how good that chunk is. But they keep switching up the tone and the genres so that you do wind up watching about 8 movies worth of ideas in pieces that may not have a through line that works. But I still think it's so ambitious, and it has payoffs like I've never seen before. Things that are set up at the beginning that pay off near the end. Incomprehensible. I think you have to have a fractured mind in order to come up with a story quite as weird as this. So I have a huge, huge thumbs up for Detention, but I warn you in advance, you may hate it. My next offbeat whodunit, Cursed. The Wes Craven whodunit werewolf movie, which at first glance does not appear to be a whodunit at all, because it's about two people who become werewolves and then keep finding bodies in their wake, only to realize later, oh no, there's a mysterious third werewolf we didn't mention who's actually killing all these people.
Okay, this may have missed this one.
I've
seen most Wes Craven films.
It was the grand reunion of Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson of Scream. And this is a delightful movie in the sense of, I would like to understand how weird Hollywood can get. Well, watch Cursed, which kinda doesn't work. It's one of those films that you watch and you go, something's wrong here. And then read about the massive reshoots that were done. There was something like 70% of the original cut of the film was removed and reshot with entirely new actors, new character arcs. The two leads were originally a couple, and in the reshoots, they became brother and sister. That's how deep the rethinking on that went.
Well, reshoots will always serve your whodunit well, I'm sure.
They were expecting Cursed to be such a hit that they decided to keep all the excised footage for the sequel. And it turns out that movie never got made, because Cursed is one of the biggest box office bombs in history. And it's a fascinating mess, though. I recommend it in that sense of, I want to watch a movie and see how crazy something can get out of control. Deep down, I still kind of like the plot structure of this, but even admitting that makes me sound like an imbecile.
Well, I've always thought one of the reasons that the classical whodunit genre has fallen out of favor is it really often requires a level of writing and planning that so many films and filmmakers are not willing to engage in these days, especially when it comes to, well, it didn't test well, so let's fix it in reshoots. You can't really do that with a film where it's presenting a wide variety of suspects and evidence, and it plays a game with the viewers where they have to play fair to the point where someone clever enough could piece it together and figure it out before the end, and that requires a lot of groundwork and a lot of setup.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't work if you move key pieces of hints and seeds out of the way. Because you've reshot and or cut moments.
Mind you, as proven in certain rare examples, and cinematically, most obviously in Clue, you can really have all the setup and all the clues, and then just swap out the endings regardless. It's like, this person did it for this reason, and here's all the evidence that led to that. Even though it's the same evidence that led to this suspect doing it, or that suspect doing it, depending on which ending you're watching.
Another offbeat whodunit, which I did see on many people's lists, but sort of struck me as, oh yeah, that is a whodunit, is Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Because of course, even the title is asking a question, and the film is structured to eventually answer that question, and it's a bit outrageous by the time you get to it, but it's effective in its own way. The mystery isn't really the point of that movie, but it certainly plays out in an uncomfortable way. The sequence where they reveal the murderer is creepy as hell. I'm going to move on from that one to huge spoiler one, because even saying this is a whodunit makes you wonder for about 1 hour and 32 minutes of 35 minutes why this is a whodunit, why I would say that, and that is the only remaining good M. Night Shyamalan movie, which is Unbreakable. That movie is a secret whodunit. Because you don't even really understand that there is a structure to something that's going on in the movie that were bad things and people are dying until the very end when you realize, oh right, this is all connected, and there's a master plan at work. Enough said about that, though. I will end up in a spiraling M. Night Shyamalan rant that no one needs.
Not to mention that it's really on the periphery of what I would define the genre.
I will move on instead to two films that are linked that it's fascinating to me to realize are whodunits. The first one is The Hateful Eight.
Oh, yes.
The Hateful Eight is the Quentin Tarantino bizarre 3-hour, one-room-ish Western, which is at its heart a drawing room whodunit.
Yeah, it kind of is.
Because it's all about a group of people who don't know each other meeting another group of people, and any of them might be in on a plot to rescue a criminal by any murderous needs necessary.
It's kind of a who's gonna do it.
Yep. Well, there's a whodunit aspect to it already. We just don't know up front there's already been a massacre.
That's true.
And the elements that play. And the interesting thing is some of the people are fully in on it, and others are just quietly going along with it because they know their necks are on the line. And that's interesting, because they're essentially innocents who are complicit. So there's a lot of interesting elements to that. So Hateful Eight, I find, falls very squarely into the whodunit genre, but a movie people might not see as a whodunit that I feel also, at least peripherally fits, is Reservoir Dogs. In this case, the whodunit is, who's the cop? That's the whodunit aspect.
Yeah.
Because that is the person who has caused all the
I would say that
the
one
main
is more
characters.
who's the plagiarist. And
But
we all know who that is.
I'm just gonna. Well, let's be clear. The movie it's based on is not a whodunit.
No, not at all. In fact, it's not even based on that whole film. It's based on the final act of a film.
So Reservoir Dogs in itself reinvents a movie or blatantly rips off. You can use your own language. But it does add the whodunit element to it in that we, the audience, are unaware of who the character is, who is the rat, essentially, who is the police, potentially, because we're not even sure there is a rat. There could just be good intel from somebody else when you start watching that movie, but the question becomes, which one of these criminals isn't a criminal? And it is a fantastic reveal. It is one of those moments, I actually think it's one of the highlights of cinematic history, is the reveal of who or what might be responsible for why everything went wrong. That sequence gave me chills when I originally saw it and still works for me. I think it's basically the single best moment of Tarantino's career. And it's not stolen from that other thing.
Well, that'll be one element of it.
My final offbeat whodunit before we go to the break, and this is a real offbeat whodunit, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective.
Oh, good lord.
Because that is absolutely one of those films. It is entirely based around someone doing stuff that's bad.
Now,
who could it be?
Now, is it the first one or the second one that features him coming out of the rhinoceros ass?
That's the second one.
Okay.
You mean the good one?
Because
The second one is
there is a
in
crime
Africa.
we need to solve. Who done it for that one?
Yeah, no, he travels the world in the second one. In the first one, he's just essentially in Florida or somewhere along those lines. And, but it does fall into the category of a whodunit, and it is, it's not a good whodunit. I just think it's noteworthy. It's worth mentioning as just sort of an offbeat. It still works in the genre. I mean, it is amazing how people hate that film now because of its transphobia. It is astonishing. It's like the number one suspect.
I have not thought of that film since 5 minutes after I saw it when it first came out. So
yeah, it is. It has a transphobia rant to the point of hate.
When the rhinoceros ass scene from the second one sticks in my mind more than anything else in that two-film series.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and come back with some interesting additions to the whodunit genre, all of which I consider to be far superior to Knives Out, which opens Friday. It really isn't worth flagging this hard, but it's hard not to. In fact,
I'm going to have to do my
very
Agatha
curious.
Christie aside, though, for 5 minutes at some point, if we can shoot it in. Just
all right. I have like 3 to mention up top, and then you can
Sure.
jump into it. Because there's like 10 more I want to talk about, but they're not important.
How the fuck is it that loud 2 rooms away?
And that's like soundproofed.
Yeah. It's like, what the fuck? I was really throwing there when I was trying to talk when it first started up.
I mean, I know that it's not coming through, so...
Yeah, I know. It was so loud it sounded
I'm
like
not
it
mad
was
at them
coming
the
through
way I was. The other guy. We're almost back.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back to CGLS 1690 AM. You're listening to Cinema Smackdown, where today we are running down a list of whodunits, all of which I think are far, far better than Rian Johnson's Knives Out that's coming out this coming Friday. So, I've talked about the straight-up recommendation whodunits, which included movies like The Last of Sheila, Dead Again, Mindhunters. And then we got into the really weird whodunits or offbeat films that might not fully be considered part of that genre, but I think are interesting just to bring up in that respect. Movies like Definitely Maybe, which is a romantic comedy with a whodunit aspect. And then we got into the weeds with the Tarantino films that are kind of whodunits. And I'm going to mention a couple of movies that fully fall into the whodunit category that people don't necessarily bring up that I just think are worth quickly mentioning. And my first one, I have never heard anyone mention this movie at all, let alone in the context of a whodunit. But in 2014, Arnold Schwarzenegger made a return to his cinematic career after many years. I think it was 2013, 2014, started making movies again. And he made about 5 movies in a year or two that were just completely ignored and or didn't really work in his particular movie star category. The movie I saw the least written about, that people seem the least interested in altogether, is called Sabotage. And it's a movie where he plays essentially a police captain or a leader of a squad. And you figure out pretty early on that he and all of his buddies are corrupt cops. And then they get knocked off one by one. And the question is it one of them or is it somebody else? This movie is very much a whodunit, but hilariously, it is also essentially a serial killer movie, like a dense, nasty, almost a Friday the 13th, starring cops. And hilariously, it is by David Ayers, who started out his career making only films I liked, and then eventually made Suicide Squad. Oh, and Bright. That was his back-to-back combo of movies that just angered me. But Sabotage, I think, is right before both of those. I could be wrong. And it's his last interesting film. I will say that Sabotage is absolutely a film I put in the category of interesting failure. But it's certainly interesting, and it's got a bunch of fantastic character actors playing the squad. It is kind of an impossible to see what's coming next movie, probably because it's a bit of a mess, but it's still an interesting addition to the genre. 2 films I want to mention real quick, both of which I know you've seen and have opinions on. I'll just say both their titles, and talk about how they are structurally similar. Those 2 movies, as far as I'm concerned, are somewhat whodunits, is The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp and Angel Heart, the Mickey Rourke movie. They are both movies in which an investigator goes from location to location throughout the running time of the film, and at every new location, discovers a body. Scene after scene after scene, to the point where after about 3 of those scenes in each of these movies you go, am I really in for another 75 minutes of you discovering body after body after body? Which is just what keeps happening.
I'm very fond of both of those films, although I will say Angel Heart is a little detracted by a near the end special effects shot, which is cheesy even by 1980 standards.
I do remember that shot, so I'm all the better for it, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's be clear, Ninth Gate has some god-awful special effects near the end. There's a couple of things that really take away from that movie for me. But
I'm not sure what you're talking about there, because I'm kind of universally fond of that film.
Both of these films involve fire.
Yeah.
At any rate, I'm very fond of both of them on a tonal level. I find they both capture some weird mood. Alan Parker directed Angel Heart, and the much reviled Roman Polanski directed Ninth Gate. They both have very, very interesting aesthetic values in terms of how their films work. So that's a couple interesting additions to the genre. I have a lot more, but Shane, I wanted to give you a moment because you wanted to give a little shout-out to a little-known pocket of whodunit movies. What would those be?
Well, certainly Agatha Christie has been adapted since, most of her books were written in the 20s and 30s, and they started bringing them to the screen fairly early on. Never to her pleasure, really. The first one...
That woman!
No, I know, she was quite...
Nothing made her happy.
Perhaps she did not care for the...
She was upset they changed the title to And Then There Were None.
No, she might not have been very pleased with the 4 Miss Marple films that they made in the 1960s starring Margaret Rutherford. If you ever want to see fat Miss Marple, That's the film. That's the film series for you.
I do, and I will.
I always think of Miss Marple as a little old British lady, not this beast of a woman, shall we say? They're fun films, but it is disconcerting. But she was very pleased. She got to the point where she almost didn't want to sell rights to make films of her books anymore. And she was finally convinced to do it again in the 70s. And this is the last one they made before she died. And that was Murder on the Orient Express, starring Albert Finney as Hercule Poirot. And she was very pleased with that one, except for his mustache. I don't know if she would be much more pleased with Kenneth Branagh's mustache in the recent remake. I know I wasn't. A little point of trivia regarding that. So Albert Finney was 37 when he was playing Poirot, who is typically depicted as being like in the 55 to 60 range. And so they had to put him in a lot of makeup. The problem was they had a grueling shoot, and Finney was also doing a play at the time. So he was getting no sleep. So an arrangement was made where after the play he was in, he would go to bed, and in the morning when it was time to shoot the movie, an ambulance would show up at his house and get him out of bed in his pajamas without waking him up, and they would start to apply the makeup while he was asleep in the ambulance, and then he would be awake by the time they were on set. And the makeup was so hot in the confined quarters of the train cars that they're shooting in that when they came to wanting to continue with the series with Death on the Nile several years later, Finney said, "I am not wearing that makeup in Egypt. No way too hot." So they got Peter Ustinov instead, and Ustinov ended up playing the part six times in total. But to give you an idea of how awful the shoot of Death on the Nile was, Betty Davis had an interesting quote. Betty Davis, who was famous for grousing about just about everything, she said, basically back in her day, they would have just built the Nile for them. Right. These days, filmmaking is like a travel log, and actors have become all stuntmen.
That's great.
And the grueling heat that film was shot under, I would have to agree with her on that point. You would have to get me a stunt double to want to do that one. But this was part of a cluster of a revival of the whodunit genre that happened in the 70s and
including
early 80s.
A lot of comedy films.
Yeah, but I was talking specifically this cluster of Agatha Christie adaptations that happened.
I'm just throwing that detail in. There are so many comedies like Foul Play and
Murder by Decree.
Murder by Death.
So Murder by Death is the one. Murder by Decree is actually a Sherlock Holmes movie. Sorry, a different film.
But you were saying.
Also was the second big screen appearance by Miss Marple, as played by Angela Lansbury, who would go on to play a very Miss Marple type of character on Murder, She Wrote. She starred as a character in The Mirror Cracked, which was another big all-star vehicle. And then the last one of this cycle was Evil Under the Sun, again with Ustinov as Poirot, directed by Guy Hamilton of old classic James Bond fame.
And Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins.
And indeed, Remo Williams, yes. Unfortunately by that time it was played out, and then the whodunit genre got shuffled off to television for years and years and years.
True.
But we are starting to see a bit of a revival again, because not only have we had that Kenneth Branagh remake of Murder on the Orient Express, which was apparently successful enough that they have decided, yes, they are also going to remake Death on the Nile, which was due to come out next year.
Yep, we're into that.
Although they set up Death on the Nile at the end of the Murder on the Orient Express film in such an irritating way for me, where it's like, it basically gets off the train and said, well, there's been a murder on the Nile.
Yeah, it's Game of Thrones rules.
It's like, yeah, this is the 1930s. By the time he gets there, that body's not going to be very fresh.
Yeah.
and the suspects will all have died of heat stroke waiting for him to arrive.
All right, I'm going to quickly mention a few more movies I think are notable. Again, every one of these is better than Knives Out, which again, not terrible, but I just feel like people should really delve deep into this genre if they're planning to waste $13 on a lesser movie. So here are a bunch of movies. Many of these are controversial. People may not like them, but they are hilarious and or interesting additions. There is the Bruce Willis movie, certainly from the lowest point of his career, called Color of Night, which is the weirdest whodunit you're ever gonna see, and I don't think it's even possible to see the theatrical cut of this anymore because it seems to have vanished, but the director's cut of this movie includes an amazing insert shot of Bruce Willis's penis, which is so egotistical and hilarious.
Did the penis do it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's definitely one of them. There is a movie, it's not quite structured like a whodunit, but definitely has that aspect, is the Jack Reacher movie by Christopher McQuarrie. It's more about an event, and that the person who did the event couldn't have done the event, therefore what is the conspiracy? But ultimately it has elements of whodunit, and I couldn't recommend a movie more than Jack Reacher. Even though most people hate Tom Cruise, and most people think he was wrong for the part, I still think it's a masterpiece. Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I quite enjoyed that Jack Reacher film.
Here's one I think you hate, that I'm quite fond of. The January Man.
Oh dear,
Almost
yes.
the opposite of a whodunit.
Yes, it is the antithesis of what a proper whodunit should be.
But that's fine. That movie should exist. There should be a film that leads you down a path and
No.
then says, no, that's not the point. The point is, it's no one. And I love that idea. There's Primal Fear with Edward Norton and Richard Gere, which is an excellent movie if you haven't had it ruined for you already. It's a 20-year-old movie now, so it... there is Memento, which, for all of its weird plotting, is essentially a whodunit. It doesn't stress the whodunit so much, even though the character keeps kind of saying it. It's more about the structure, but it falls into the category.
Okay, I'm going to slip that arsenic in your tea right now.
Because you don't agree?
No, because I have to get one more classic, genuine, 100%, this is the structure of what a whodunit is. I would be remiss if I did not mention the Alistair Sim film from way back when called Green for Danger. This is a whodunit that takes place in a hospital right at the end of World War II, to the point where the opening scene, Alistair Sim is left ducking because there are still V-1 and V-2 rockets coming over from Germany, or France in the case of the launch pads. And he goes to investigate a murder in a hospital, and it's interesting thematically because it answers the question, at the end of such massive global slaughter, does one murder still matter?
Nice. All right, I'm going to quickly run through the rest in the last 30 seconds. There is April Fool's Day from the 80s, which is an interesting take on it. There's Deep Red by Dario Argento, which I think is his best whodunit. There's Scream 2. I think Scream 2's mystery is much more interesting and much more whodunity than the first one. Body Double by Brian De Palma has an interesting couple twists in it. Dressed to Kill as well, although that one's a little on the nose. There's the Sleepy Hollow movie by Tim Burton, which pretends it's a whodunit until you realize it doesn't matter. There's Basic Instinct, which I think is an interesting film, but it kind of doesn't matter who did it. Tenebrae by Argento, which is my favorite of his. Name of the Rose, the Sean Connery movie.
Yes.
Odd.
That is a real classic one.
Finally, the last show I want to mention, Friday the 13th, the original, and Psycho 2. I never miss a chance to mention Psycho 2. That is 35 better.
You made it. Barely.
We're going to let you go, everybody. Thanks. I've been Michael Brody. I've been joined by Shane Simmons. We'll see you next time. Well, I did it. I got my whole list in. Hey. That's where the 90-minute show would have done me better.
Yeah,
that's
true.
Life. Nice to see you back.
What? Likewise.
Missed you last week?
Yeah, I had to do a big ass detour because I usually take the 40 and then take the carry.
Oh, you literally got stuck.
And they closed the on-ramp onto the carry, so I had to go.
That's a constant. If you're coming from a distance, this is a tough spot.
And I was like, why did they close it on a Saturday afternoon?
Good luck on the show.